Okay guys, so today inshallah we have a new selection and our selection's title is Hatchet. This selection has written by Gary Paulson. Genre, realistic fiction, has characters and settings that seem real but are actually imaginary. So it's realistic fiction. Question of the week: how does facing a challenge help us learn about ourselves? So the title of our selection for this week is Hatchet by Gary Paulson. Genre, realistic fiction, has characters and settings that seem real but are actually imaginary. Question of the week: how does facing a challenge help us learn about ourselves? First of all, guys, as usual, we have to know about the author of the story, who has written this story, and why was his attitude to write such a story. So, meet the author, Gary Paulson. So, let's know about the author. It's page 351, guys. Pay your attention and listen to the reader, please.
Meet the author, Gary Paulson. Gary Paulson is one of America's most important writers of books for young people. Hatchet, a modern-day classic, is a Newbery Honor book, as are his novels Dog Song and The Winter Room. Mr. Paulson's life changed the wintry day he went into a Minnesota library to warm up. He says, "The librarian asked me if I would like a library card. I was a real cocky kid and said, 'Sure, why not?' So she gave me a card, and the most astonishing thing happened. This silly little card with my name on it gave me an identity I had not had. I felt I had become somebody." And he read up to a book a day. When he was young, Mr. Paulson tried a number of jobs to support himself, from migrant worker to ranch hand to truck driver. Many of his books about the outdoors are based on his early life as a hunter and trapper, and his later years running the Iditarod dog sled race and sailing the Pacific. He now lives with his wife in New Mexico. Here are other books about survival: Brian's Winter and My Side of the Mountain.
Okay, guys, so every writer has its own attitude toward life, towards life. So this Gary Paulson has written about Hatchet and about living outdoors because his life was like that. So every writer, why do I ask you always to read about the author? Just to know about the mind of this author and about how was his or her life that time and why his or her attitude towards writing is like that. So you have to know the school of the writer. Every writer has its own school, has its own ideas to write about. So Hatchet, this is our story about hunting or about like trapper. So because of the life of like Gary Paulson that time, so his like early life as a hunter and a trapper, and his later like years running the editor dog sled race and sailing the Pacific. So anyway, like the life of Gary Paulson was outdoors always, so that's why he has written this selection. And the next, we have main elements for any selection, guys. We have a plot, so say what happened in the selection, and characters are involved in the selection, and setting, where and when the selection or the story or the incidents in the story took place. Conflict means the problems that are struggling with in the story between characters, and theme, what lesson did you learn from the selection. Let's read. We have this page, guys. It's page 335, and you're reading a city book, and it's very important page. Always we get such a page for in a new selection. This page has the new vocabularies that we can guess when we read this the page. So right now, let's listen to the reader of this page. So pay your attention and open the page 335.
And sailing the Pacific. Quill. Small. Wilderness camp. I woke early to unfamiliar sounds. Slowly it registered in my mind that I was not at home, but in a tent in the north woods of Michigan. My whole body had stiffened from sleeping with only a sleeping bag between me and the remarkably hard ground. Why had I signed on for wilderness camp? I wasn't sure I could take a month of roughing it. Soon everyone was up and concentrating on breakfast. First, we would have to build a fire. We had sat up late last night until the campfire was only ash and embers that smoldered. Our counselor, Daniel, had doused it well with water from the river. An unattended campfire could start a forest fire, and we didn't want that. I took a hatchet and began to cut a dead branch into firewood. Daniel built the fire using painstaking care. He started with wadded up newspaper and small dead twigs. We would lean the larger pieces of wood around this and then ignite the paper. As we worked, I showed Daniel the curious hollow stick I had found yesterday. He told me it was a quill from a porcupine.
Okay, guys, so this is about this page, and I think it may help you to understand or to guess the meanings of the new vocabularies, or even to write a sentence by using the new vocabularies. If I want to write a sentence by using the new word, so I can, when I read this page, so I can guess the meanings, and I can read and I can write a sentence for each word. Vocabularies time. Now we have the new vocabularies, guys. So the first word we have today, it's hatchet. Hatchet. This word is noun. Knowing the part of a speech of the word is very important, guys, because that time you decide the position of this word in the sentence. It's a noun that I can begin the sentence with that. It's a verb that can be like a predicate, or it's an adjective, or it's like adverb. So knowing the part of a speech is very important. So hatchet is noun, and it means a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. A small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. It's called hatchet. Hatchet. Next word, number 2, it's ignite. 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 So simple to pronounce it. Ignite, it's verb, and it means to set on fire. To set on fire, called ignite. To set on fire, it's verb. Okay. Word number 3, painstaking. Painstaking. It's an adjective. And it means very careful, particular, or diligent. So when you say painstaking, that means you have many different other synonyms for this word. That means when I say painstaking, and I can explain the meaning to the others, so I can say it's very careful, or you can say it's particular, or you can say it's diligent. So this word has many different synonyms. Painstaking, it's an adjective, means very careful, or means particular, or means diligent. Word number 4, quell, it's noun. Quell, it's noun. And a quell means a stiff, sharp hair or spine, like the pointed end of a feather, called a quell. So quell is a stiff, sharp hair or spine, like the pointed end of a feather, called quell. So this is noun. And the next word is registered. Registered. The word is verb, and it means to have had some effect, to have made an impression. An impression. Registered, it's verb, and it means to have had some effect or to have made an impression, called registered. Next word, smoldered. Smoldered, it's verb, and it means burnt or smoked without a flame. Flame means fire. Smoldered, it's verb, and it means burnt and smoked without flame. It's called like a smoldered. Next word, it's stiffened. Stiffened, it's verb, and it means to have been made or have become rigid, or it means fixed. So when you say stiffened, means fixed. Stiffened, it's verb, and it means to have been made or have become rigid, fixed. And this is the last word we have today, and we have the question of the week, guys. How does facing a challenge help us learn about ourselves? Learning about ourselves through challenge, external challenge, internal challenge, or like actions. And this is about our lesson. So right now, guys, let's pronounce the words together. Okay, عبادة ربيع.
Yes, Mr.
Okay, عبادة, pronounce the words and say the meaning for each.
Okay. Hatchet. A small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite. To set on fire. Painstaking. Very careful, particular, diligent. Quill. A stiff, sharp hair or spell like the pointed end of a feather. Registered. To have had some effect, to have made an impression. Smoldered. Burned and smoked without flame. Stiffened. To have been made or have become rigid, fixed.
Okay, thanks يا عبادة. محمد خالد.
Yes, Mr.
Okay.
Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite, to set on fire. Painstaking, very careful. Particular, diligent. Quill, a stiff, sharp hair or spine like the pointed end of a feather. Registered. To have some effect. To have made an impression. Smaller. Burned and smoked without flame. Stiffened. To have been made or have come rigged.
Okay. محمد عبد العزيز. عبد العزيز عبد الشافع.
Mister.
ها محمد عبد العزيز.
Yes.
Okay, pronounce.
Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite to set on fire. Bent stacking, very careful, particular, diligent. Quill, a stuff.
يا محمد.
Don't see the screen.
This is your problem. Fix your internet.
Okay.
عبد العزيز عبد الشافع.
Yes, mister.
ها يا عبد العزيز. عبد العزيز. زي عبد الشافع. الله.
Hello.
Read the word.
Mister, you hear me?
Again.
Mister, you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite, to set on fire. Painstaking, very careful, or practical or diligent. Quill, a stiff, sharp hair or spine like the pointed end of a feather. Register, to have had some effect, to have made an impression. Smolder, burned and smoked without flame. Stiffen, to have been made or have become rigid or fixed.
Okay. جعفر. جعفر محمد.
Yes, mister.
Read the words يا جعفر.
Okay. Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite, to set on fire.
Ignite.
To set on fire. Painstaking, very careful. Quill, a stiff, sharp hair or spin like a pointed end of a feather. Registered, to have had some effect, to have made an impression. Smoldered, burned and smoked without flame. Stiffened, to have been made or have become rigid, fixed.
Okay. مازن معاذ.
Yes, mister.
Okay, مازن.
Selection vocabulary.
Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite to set on fire. Painstaking, very carefully, particular, diligent. Quill, a stiff, sharp hair or spine like the pointed of the end of a feather. Registered to have some effects to have made an impression. Smoldered, burned, wound, smoked without flame. Stiffened, to have been made or have become rigged, fixed.
Okay. فيصل أبكر.
Mister.
فيصل.
Hatchet, a small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. Ignite to set on fire. Painstaking, very careful, particular, delicate, cool, a, a stiff, sharp hair or spin link the pointed end of a feather. Registered to have had some effect, to have made an impression. Smoldered, burden and smoke without flame. Stipended, to have been made for, have become wrecked, fixed.
Okay. رافي أيمن.
Yes, Mister.
بيدي رافي.
Hatchet, a small axe. What a short request to have had some handle for use with one hand. Forget to have made an impression again to scene set on fire. Smoldered, burned, and smoked. Fascinating, very powerful. The house column. Particular, diligent, Stephen to have been made for well a stiff, sharp hair or thing like the pointed need of a father. Have become ragged, fixed.
Okay. أنور فضل. أنور. خالد موسى. Okay, guys. So right now, let's open our reading series books in the selection. So just 1 second. Okay, so the first word is hatchet. It's noun, guys. Small axe with a short handle for use with one hand. And the next word is ignite. It's verb, and it means to set on fire. And the next word is painstaking. It's adjective, and it means very careful or particular, diligent. Okay. And the next word is a quill, and it's noun, and it means stiff, sharp hair or spine, like the pointed end of a feather. And the next word is registered. It's verb, and it means to have had some effect or to have made an impression. The next word is smoldered, and it's verb. And it means burned and smoked without flame. And the next word and the last one is stiffened, and it's verb, and it means to have been made or have become rigid or fixed. Okay, guys. Okay, so right now let's open our reading city book. Just 1 second. Listen. Okay, so open page, guys, 336. 336. Okay, Muhammad Khalid.
Yes, Mr.
Read يا محمد.
Okay. Hatchet by Gary Paulson. Genre. Realistic fiction. Has characters and settings that seem real but are actually imaginary. As you read, think about the things that makes this story seem like it could really happen.
Okay. Let's listen to the reader just 1 second. Okay, next page guys.
Mister, we don't hear.
Keep reading يا محمد.
Okay,
You hear the sound or not يا محمد?
okay.
No.
I see. Okay.
No, we don't hear.
Okay, no problem. So read 337. I think I have a problem in the sound.
Okay. Question of the week. How does facting challenges help us learn about ourselves? Let's think about reading.
Okay. The next page, 338.
Okay. Brian is on his way to visit his father in North Canada. When the pilot of the small single-engine plane in which he is flying suffered a fatal air attack, forced crash land the plane. Brian suddenly finds himself alone in Canadian wilderness with only a hatchet to help him survive. At first, he thought it was a grove. In the still darkness, the shelter in the middle of the night. His eyes came open and he was awake and he thought there was a grove, but it was the wind. A medium wind in the pine had made some sound that brought him awake. He sat and was hit with the smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of rot, some musty rot that made him think only of graves with cobwebs and dust and old death. His horse no, his nostril widened and he opened his eyes widened, but he could see nothing. It was too dark, too hard, too hard dark, with clouds covering even the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But yeah, but the smell was alive and full in the shelter. He thought of the bear, through of Bigfoot, and every monster he had ever seen in every sci movie. He had ever had in his head. Then he heard the snoring, a, too, a brushing sound, a sleeping, brushing sound, near his feet, and he kicked as hard as he could, kicked out and threw the hatchet at the side. Noise coming from the road, but the hatchet missed. sailed was a rock with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly thrown pain, as if 100 needles had been driven into it.
Okay.
Oh,
So let's listen to the reader. May it works.
Brian is on his way to visit his father in northern Canada when the pilot of the small, single-engine plane in which he is flying suffers a fatal heart attack. Forced to crash land the plane, Brian suddenly finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness with only a hatchet to help him survive. At first he thought it was a growl. In the still darkness of the shelter in the middle of the night, his eyes came open and he was awake and he thought there was a growl. But it was the wind. A medium wind in the pines had made some sound that brought him up, brought him awake. He sat up and was hit with the smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of rot, some musty rot that made him think only of graves with cobwebs and dust and old death. His nostrils widened and he opened his eyes wider, but he could see nothing. It was too dark, too hard dark, with clouds covering even the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But the smell was alive, alive and full and in the shelter. He thought of the bear, thought of Bigfoot and every monster he had ever seen in every fright movie he had ever watched, and his heart hammered in his throat. Then he heard the slithering, a brushing sound, a slithering, brushing sound near his feet. And he kicked out as hard as he could, kicked out and threw the hatchet at the sound, a noise coming from his throat. But the hatchet missed, sailed into the wall where it hit the rocks with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly torn with pain, as if 100 needles had been driven into it. Ong!
Okay. Next page يا محمد خالد. Or عبادة. Thanks يا محمد.
Yes, Mister.
Read يا عبادة. 339.
369. Okay. Now he screamed with the pain and fear and skitter on his backside, up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth, straining to see, to hear the slithering moved again. He thought toward him at first, and terror took him, stopping his breath. He felt he could see a low dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away, slithering and scraping. It moved away, and he saw, or thought he saw, it go out of the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment, then followed a rasping breath in and held it, listening for the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg, where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers generally touched a group of needles that has been driven through his pants and into uh, the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends that stuck out, and he knew that then what the What the attacker had been a participant had into had scrambled into his shelter, and when he had kicked it, the thing had slapped him with its tail of quills. He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into into his leg, but there were only white pinning the cloth agent had skin. He leaned back against the wall for a minute. He could leave them, and they had to come out, but just touch them made the pain more intense.
Okay, so let's listen to the reader.
Now he screamed with the pain and fear and skittered on his backside up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth, straining to see, to hear. The slithering moved again. He thought toward him at first, and terror took him, stopping his breath. He felt he could see a low, dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away, slithering and scraping it moved away, and he saw or thought he saw it go out of the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment, then pulled a rasping breath in and held it, listening for the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg, where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers gingerly touched a group of needles that had been driven through his pants and into the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends that stuck out, and he knew then what the attacker had been. A porcupine had stumbled into his shelter, and when he had kicked it, the thing had slapped him with its tail of quills. He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into his leg, but there were only 8, pinning the cloth against his skin. He leaned back against the wall for a minute. He couldn't leave them in, they had to come out, but just touching them made the pain more intense.
Okay.
Quill. Noun. A stiff, sharp hair or spine like the pointed end of a feather. A porcupine releases quills on its back when it feels threatened. Noun plural. Quills.
Abdulaziz Abdul Shafa.
Yes, Mr.
Okay, page 340.
So fast, he thought,
Speak up, ya Abdulaziz, speak up.
so fast, thing changed. When he was gone to sleep, he had satisfaction, and in just a moment, it was all different. He grasped one of the quills, held his breath, and jerked. It sent pain signals to his brain in tight waves, but he grabbed another, pulled it. Then another quill when he had pulled it. Then another quill when he had pulled it. Of them he stopped for a moment. The pain had gone. If for from being a pointed injury, pain to spreading in a hot smear up his leg, and it made him catch his breath. Some of the quills were driven in deeper than others, and they tore when they came out. He breathed deeply twice, let half of the breath out, and went back to work. Jerk, pews, jerk, and 3 more times before he lays back in the darkness. Done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg arching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much, just too much. jerk, pause, jerk, and three more chin before he lay back in the darkness. Done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg arching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much, just too much, and he couldn't take it. Not the way it was. I can't take it this way, alone, with no fire and in the dark. And next time there might be something worse, maybe a bear, and it wouldn't be just close. The leg, it would be worse. I can't do this, he thought again and again. I can't breathe. Brain pulled himself up until he was sitting upright back in the corner of the cave. He put his hand, he put his head down in his arms, crossed his knees with stiffness, taking his left leg, and cried until he was carried out. He did not know how long it took, but later he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which have that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It wasn't just that it was wrong to do, or that it was considered.
Okay, let's listen to the reader.
So fast, he thought. So fast things change. When he'd gone to sleep, he had satisfaction, and in just a moment it was all different. He grasped one of the quills, held his breath, and jerked. It sent pain signals to his brain in tight waves, but he grabbed another, pulled it, then another quill. When he had pulled four of them, he stopped for a moment. The pain had gone from being a pointed injury pain to spreading in a hot smear up his leg, and it made him catch his breath. Some of the quills were driven in deeper than others, and they tore when they came out. He breathed deeply twice, let half of the breath out, and went back to work. Jerk, pause, jerk. And three more times before he lay back in the darkness. Done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg aching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much, just too much, and he couldn't take it. Not the way it was. I can't take it this way, alone with no fire and in the dark. And next time it might be something worse, maybe a bear, and it wouldn't be just quills in the leg, it would be worse. I can't do this, he thought, again and again. I can't. Brian pulled himself up until he was sitting upright back in the corner of the cave. He put his head down on his arms across his knees, with stiffness taking his left leg, and cried until he was cried out. He did not know how long it took, but later he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which was that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It wasn't just that it was wrong to do, or that it was considered.
Okay. ماذا معاذ؟
That
341.
incorrect was more than that. It didn't work when he sat alone in the darkness and cried and was all done with it. Nothing had changed. His legs still hurt, and it was still dark. He was still alone, and the thought that he had accomplished nothing. At least he slept again, but already his buttons were changing, and the sleep was light, resting those more Ariston does more than a deep sleep, with a small sound awaking him twice in the rest of the night. In the last
period before daylight, before the awakened finally with the morning light and the clouds of new mosquito dreamed. His time it was not of his mother but this, of his father at first and then of the French theory of his country. It initial segment of the dream, his father was standing at the side of the living room looking at him. And it was clear from the expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there was no sound and not a whisper. She waved his hands at Brian, made with gestures, 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 gestures in front of his face as if he were scratching not something and he would make a word with his mouth, but at first Brian could not see it.
Okay, listen to the reader.
Incorrect. It was more than that. It didn't work. When he sat alone in the darkness and cried and was all done with it, nothing had changed. His leg still hurt, it was still dark, he was still alone, and the self-pity had accomplished nothing. At last he slept again, but already his patterns were changing, and the sleep was light, a resting doze more than a deep sleep, with small sounds awakening him twice in the rest of the night. In the last doze period before daylight, before he awakened finally with the morning light and the clouds of new mosquitoes, he dreamed. This time it was not of his mother, but of his father at first, and then of his friend Terry. In the initial segment of the dream, his father was standing at the side of a living room looking at him, and it was clear from his expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there was no sound, not a whisper. He waved his hands at Brian, made gestures in front of his face, as if he were scratching something, and he worked to make a word with his mouth, but at first Brian could not see it.
Okay, فيصل أبكر. فيصل.
Yes, mister.
Read 42, 342.
Okay. Then the lips made an shape, but no sound came. Mem, 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 mema. Brain could not hear it, could not understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard, and when Brain couldn't understand, he looked crosses the way he did when Brain asked questions for more than once, and he added Brett's father faded into a, a, a fog place Brain could not see, and the dream was almost over, or seemed to be. when Terry came, he was not posturing to Brian, but was standing in the park at a beach looking at a bear because Pete and for a time nothing happened. Then he got up and potted some charcoal from a bag into to cooker, then some sister flirt, and he took a fake type of light lighter and lit the field when it was burning, and the charcoal was at last getting hot. He turned and smelled and pointed to the fire as if to say, "See a fire," but it meant nothing to Brian except that except that he wished he had a fire. He saw a crockery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it must contain hot dogs and chips and mustard, and he could think only of the food, but Terry shook his head and pointed again to the fire, and twice more he pointed to the fire, made Brian see the 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 flames, and Brian felt his frustration and anger rise, and he thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fear. I know about fear. I know I need a fear. I know that.
Fire is not fear. Okay, so let's listen to this.
Then the lips made an shape, but no sound came. Ma. Brian could not hear it, could not understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard, and when Brian couldn't understand, he looked cross, the way he did when Brian asked questions more than once, and he faded. Brian's father faded into a fog place Brian could not see, and the dream was almost over, or seemed to be, when Terry came. He was not gesturing to Brian, but was sitting in the park at a bench looking at a barbecue pit, and for a time, nothing happened. Then he got up and poured some charcoal from a bag into the cooker, then some starter fluid, and he took a flick type of lighter and lit the fluid. When it was burning and the charcoal was at last getting hot, he turned, noticing Brian for the first time in the dream. He turned and smiled and pointed to the fire as if to say, "See, a fire." But it meant nothing to Brian except that he wished he had a fire. He saw a grocery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it must contain hot dogs and chips and mustard, but he could think of only the food. But Terry shook his head and pointed again to the fire, and twice more he pointed to the fire, made Brian see the flames, and Brian felt his frustration and anger rise, and he thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fire. I know about fire. I know I need a fire. I know that.
Okay, next page, guys. Jafar. Jafar.
Yes, Mister.
Okay, 43, 343.
Okay. Let's seize upon it, and there was light in the cave, a gaudy, dim light of morning. He whipped his mouth and tried to move his leg, which had stiffened like wood. There was thirst and hunger, and he ate at some ra- rasp, rasp, raspberries from the jacket. They had spoiled a bit, seemed softer and mushier, but still had a rich sweetness. He crushed the burrs against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and drank the sweet juice as it rained down his throat. A flash of metal caught his eye, and he saw his hatchet in the sand where he had thrown it at the propane. In the dark, he stood up, wincing a bit when he bent his stiff leg and crawled to where the hatchet lay. He backed it up and examined it, and saw a chip in the top of the head. The neck wasn't large, but the hatchet was important to him. Was he his only stool, and he should not have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an example away, make a staff, a thought, or a lamps. Or alarms and save the budget. Something came, then a thought as he held the hatchet. Something about the dream and his father and Terry, but he couldn't pin it down. Oh, he scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and started his back muscles and his sore leg, it over his head. It thought the first rays of the morning sun, the first faint light hit and the silver of the hatchet and flashed a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant glowed in the light like fire. That is it, he thought, that what they were trying to tell me.
Okay, let's listen to the reader, guys.
His eyes opened, and there was light in the cave, a gray, dim light of morning. He wiped his mouth and tried to move his leg, which had stiffened like wood. There was thirst and hunger, and he ate some raspberries from the jacket. They had spoiled a bit, seemed softer and mushier, but still had a rich sweetness. He crushed the berries against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and drank the sweet juice as it ran down his throat. A flash of metal caught his eye, and he saw his hatchet in the sand where he had thrown it at the porcupine in the dark. He scooched up, wincing a bit when he bent his stiff leg, and crawled to where the hatchet lay. He picked it up and examined it and saw a chip in the top of the head. The nick wasn't large, but the hatchet was important to him, was his only tool, and he should not have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an animal away. Make a staff, he thought, or a lance, and save the hatchet. Something came then, a thought as he held the hatchet, something about the dream and his father and Terry, but he couldn't pin it down. Ah! He scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and stretched his back muscles and his sore leg. The hatchet was still in his hand, and as he stretched and raised it over his head, it caught the first rays of the morning sun. The first faint light hit the silver of the hatchet and flashed a brilliant gold in the light, like fire. That is it, he thought, what they were trying to tell me.
Okay. Close your mic يا جعفر. Close your mic.
نتوي مستر ليش أبغى
عبالي close your mic يا عبالي. Okay. محمد عبد العزيز. محمد عبد العزيز. Hamad. Yes.
Okay.
So
Via
page.
the,
Yes, go on.
via the hatchet was the key to it all. When he threw the hatchet at the porcupine in the cave and missed and hit the stone wall, it had shot spark and golden shower of the hatch, golden shower of spark in dark as a golden fire as the sun was now. The hatchet was the answer. That what his father and Terry had been trying to tell him. Somehow he could get fire if from the hatchet. The sparks would make fire. Brain went back into the shelter and studied the wall. It was some form of granite or a sandstone, but embedded in it were large pieces of darker stone, a harder and a darker stone. It only took him a moment to find there the hatchet had struck the steel, had nicked into the edge of one of the darker stone pieces. Brian turned the head. Brian turned the head backwards so he would strike the flat rear of Hatchet and hit the black rock gently, too gently, and nothing happened. He struck harder and glancing blow, and two or three weak sparks skipped off the rock and dead immediately. He swung harder, held the hatchet so it would hit a longer sliding blow, and the black rock exploded in fire. Sparks flew so heavily with several of them scattered and jumped on the sand beneath the rock, and he smiled and struck again and again.
Okay.
When he threw the hatchet at the porcupine in the cave and missed and hit the stone wall, it had showered sparks, a golden shower of sparks in the dark, as golden with fire as the sun was now. The hatchet was the answer. That's what his father and Terry had been trying to tell him. Somehow he could get fire from the hatchet. The sparks would make fire. Brian went back into the shelter and studied the wall. It was some form of chalky granite or a sandstone, but embedded in it were large pieces of a darker stone, a harder and darker stone. It only took him a moment to find where the hatchet had struck. The steel had nicked into the edge of one of the darker stone pieces. Brian turned the head backward so he would strike with the flat rear of the hatchet and hit the black rock gently. Too gently, and nothing happened. He struck harder, a glancing blow, and 2 or 3 weak sparks skipped off the rock and died immediately. He swung harder, held the hatchet so it would hit a longer sliding blow, and the black rock exploded in fire. Sparks flew so heavily that several of them skittered and jumped on the sand beneath the rock, and he smiled and struck again and again. There could be fire here, he thought. Sandstone.
Okay, page 45, guys.
I will have a fire here, he thought, and struck again. I will have fire from the hatchet. Brian found it was a long way from sparks to fire. Clearly, there had to be something for the sparks to ignite, some kind of tinder or kindling. But what? He brought some dried grass in, tapped sparks into it, and watched them die. He tried small twigs, breaking them into little pieces, but that was worse than the grass. Then he tried a combination of the two, grass and twigs. Nothing. He had no trouble getting sparks, but the tiny bits of hot stone or metal, he couldn't tell which they were, just sputtered and died. He settled back on his haunches in exasperation, looking at the pitiful clump of grass and twigs. He needed something finer, something soft and fine and fluffy to catch the bits of fire. Shredded paper would be nice, but he had no paper. So close, he said aloud, so close. He put the hatchet back in his belt and went out of the shelter, limping on his sore leg. There had to be something, had to be. Man had made fire. There had been fire for thousands, millions of years. There had to be a way. He dug in his pockets and found the $20 bill in his wallet. Paper. Worthless paper out here. But if he could get a fire going...
Okay, 46.
He ripped the 20 into tiny pieces, made a pile of pieces, and hit sparks into them. Nothing happened. They just wouldn't take the sparks. But there had to be a way, some way to do it. Not 20 feet to his right, leaning out over the water, were birches, and he stood looking at them for a full half-minute before they registered on his mind. They were a beautiful white with bark like clean, slightly speckled paper. Paper. He moved to the trees. Where the bark was peeling from the trunks, it lifted in tiny tendrils, almost fluffs. Brian plucked some of them loose, rolled them in his fingers. They seemed flammable, dry, and nearly powdery. He pulled and twisted bits off the trees, packing them in one hand while he picked them with the other, picking and gathering until he had a wad close to the size of a baseball. Then he went back into the shelter and arranged the ball of birch bark peelings at the base of the black rock. As an afterthought, he threw in the remains of the $20 bill. He struck and a stream of sparks fell into the bark and quickly died. But this time, one spark fell on one small hair of dry bark, almost a thread of bark, and seemed to glow a bit brighter before it died. The material had to be finer. There had to be a soft and incredibly fine nest for the sparks. I must make a home for the sparks, he thought. A perfect home, or they won't stay, or they won't make a fire.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Time is up for this session. See you, inshallah. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, Mr. See you tomorrow. Bye, Mr. See you tomorrow.
Bye.